I think one of the very interesting part of the program is we are welcoming Ms. Shireen Bhan from the CNBC, a very distinguished lead discussant, and I hand over the event now to Shireen. Thank you.
Finance Minister, if I can start by asking you, sir, about what we can expect in terms of the future of the India-Africa partnership. India has been absolutely clear that we would like to model this partnership on a development compact. We're absolutely clear that we are committed to a more people-centric approach. The Foreign Minister has also categorically stated that we don't believe in merely extracting resources from Africa, and that is not going to be the model that India follows. If you can give us specific in terms of what we can expect. For instance, $9 billion in low-cost credit over the last 20 years. We've supported 140 projects in Africa. 60 of those projects are today complete. You have said that we will be pledging more lines of credit to Africa. If you can give us some specifics, because that seems to be an area of opportunity, also an area of disappointment perhaps as far as the Africans are concerned.
See, India and Africa are both poised for a significant economic growth. Even in the midst of global slowdown, the potential for growth in both these areas is much higher. India, of course, is one of the fastest growing emerging economies in the world. Africa, because of its natural resources, and for the long distance it still has to cover, it certainly has a huge potential for growth, it has a huge potential for investment. And as your question very rightly pointed out, India, on account of traditional historical ties, has a natural affinity with Africa. So the lines of credit which we have issued, and these can obviously be worked upon and improved further, expanded further. Our potential for our service sector growth in Africa, and this can extend from our capacity at building highways, our capacity at building ports, our capacity at building new townships where we are learning ourselves, our telecommunication sector which is fairly developed, and therefore these are all areas in which Africa also has a long distance to cover. And therefore when you speak in terms of an Indo-African partnership, I think these are all areas, and not necessarily looking at the resource-rich South Africa from that point of view. Of course, all these will be a part of mutual trade advantages to both of them. But I think the very object of this engagement is to carry forward this cooperation, and also cooperation in nourishing the human resource there.
Oftentimes, the comparison is made between how much the bilateral trade between China and Africa is and where India stands. At this point in time, while China is trying to move towards a domestic consumption economic model, it's also furthering its aspirations and pushing the cause of infrastructure diplomacy, if I could call it that. How critical is that going to be? Because you spoke about how one area of strategic importance is going to be capacity building, especially on the infrastructure side. Infrastructure diplomacy, is that going to be a strategic imperative as India tries to engage with Africa?
It would be, and it would also depend on our own domestic capacities improving. For instance, let's take areas like telecommunication. Now, over the last 2 decades, this is where our capacity building took place, and therefore our capacity of our industry to go elsewhere in the world has increased. Ports is one area where our industry's capacity now has shown a lot of potential. It's going to increase. Renewable energy is one area where our own potential has increased, and therefore our industry is going to go outside and invest in those areas. During the period which we are now trying to revive, our highway programs itself. Now, these are all areas in which our own capacity building has significantly improved. Both government, public sector and private sector industries have gained a huge amount of experience in this. And I think whether it's, you call it infrastructure building or an infrastructure diplomacy, this is inevitably going to happen.
What about energy security, sir, and how critical is Africa going to be from an energy security point of view? Because again, China is significantly ahead when it comes to engaging with Africa, when it comes to looking at acquiring assets in Africa from an energy security point of view. There's been a lot of talk about the likes of ONGC, OBL and so on and so forth, scouting for assets, looking at acquisitions. From an energy security point of view, what kind of opportunities and challenges do you foresee?
Of course, there are going to be opportunities, and I think all our organizations, again, both in the state sector and the private sector, have to look for these opportunities. After all, your own potentials are also defined, and those potentials would be fully used and exploited, and therefore for your own energy security to look elsewhere in the world, we've been slow movers over the years in this direction, and therefore,
do you see the pace picking up now?
I think so. As the health of the economy grows, as the global economy improves, as investable surplus with institutions increases, I think both for the purposes of investment and scouting for opportunities, the geographical limits won't matter.
Mr. Bashir, let me ask you, sir, in terms of what your expectations are from both the Indian government, from the Indian private sector, and what would you say could be the opportunities that India could look at when it comes to investing in Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me say that our expectation is one of really cooperation between India and Africa, and I think that's what we've been working on for a very long time now. Personally, if you look at the West African sub-region, for instance, efforts have been made to develop this relation between India and Africa and West Africa, where I come from. And a lot of developments are going on today in Africa that are geared towards enhancing this cooperation. One, democracy. African countries are now becoming more democratic. 2 days ago, there was an election in Cote d'Ivoire, very peaceful. People went freely and voted, and now we're waiting for the outcome. 2 weeks ago, in Guinea, there was another democratic election, very peaceful. The elections are out, and we're waiting for the process to continue. In Nigeria, as you know, in March, there was another election. So the environment is being prepared really for investment, and we expect Indian companies, Indian businessmen to really exploit these opportunities. It's not just a question of coming to India for a line of credit. No, that's not the issue. The issue is that we have seen lines of credit, we have seen how they also enhance development. This morning I cited some of the impacts of these lines of credit, but they want to go beyond that.
Sure.
The Honorable Minister mentioned capacity building. He mentioned setting up institutions to train and assist us in exploiting resources that are there. Take a country like Niger, take a country like the Gambia, like Senegal, that has a lot of resources in terms of winds.
Right.
But then we need to explore this wind to generate energy, renewable energy. And that is what India is helping us to develop some of these opportunities that are there. We don't see them as coming just to exploit resources. No, I think the issue is beyond exploitation. The issue goes beyond. We're now talking of capacity building. We're talking of how do we now create institutions. India is helping Rwanda to set up, I think, yesterday we were discussing. These are the kind of institutions that I think that should be created, that should be developed, so that the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, Africa can also exploit some of these resources and so on. And the minister has just also mentioned something which is very, very important. India has opened up importation of African goods from 34 countries. You mentioned it.
Yeah.
So it shows also that there are opportunities for us here in India. Unfortunately, businessmen are not aware. So one is a situation whereby Indian companies can even go to African countries, produce some of these goods, and export them to India. Why not? Because the opportunities are there.
Well, hopefully at the end of this summit, they will be aware, much more aware of the opportunities that India presents as well. But if I can ask you in terms of specific areas of opportunity, because we were talking about capacity building, institutional reform, building institutions and so on and so forth. Beyond agriculture and healthcare, as well as infrastructure, which are the obvious sort of choices, what are the other sectors that you would like to see private sector participation from India? And what is it that Africa can actually offer?
Yeah, you see, I want to say emphasis on PPPs, because if you look at governments today, the resources are getting limited. So the only thing is to get the private sector and the private sector joining with African private sector on PPPs and African financial institutions to develop, like also the chairman said today, even in areas like health sectors. The health sector, for instance, until now people believe that it's a social sector. but we can develop PPPs in that sector. So these are the kind of opportunities that we think we can come together to develop in the interest of both India and Africa and India.
Okay. Mr. Jaitley, let me give you the final word, sir. We've seen significant changes as far as this partnership is concerned. The forum itself now in its third year. This year, the largest contingent of African leaders in India engaging with our leaders and, of course, engaging with the private sector. What would be the outcomes that you would like to focus on at the end of this? What would be the specific objectives that you would like addressed at the end of this summit?
At a diplomatic level, the government certainly is going to cooperate and advance that relationship. As far as the economic relationship is concerned, I think it's going to be trade and investment. And therefore, as we've already discussed in the course of the last 1 hour on all sides, this is one area because both Asia and in Asia, India in particular, has a huge growth potential. And Africa, of course, is the continent of the future with all its resources and a lot of distance to cover. And therefore, I think we can go as far as possible and literally plan long strides as far as Indo-African relationship is concerned.
Mr. Jaitley, Mr. Bashir, Mr. Das, thank you very, very much for joining us here on the CNBC TV 18 special conversation on the future of trade and investment between India and Africa. Appreciate your time, sir. Thank you very much indeed. I hand it back to you, sir.